Hi everyone, welcome back to the part 2 of Getting Started with Twisp. This is Mike from Twisp. We've just finished installing Twisp, and now we're going to start looking at the structures of the ledgers that we've created previously in the Declare Your Resources section, and then we're going to start posting some transactions and then querying them. So first, before we get started, let's take a look at the resources we've declared. In the resources, we have declared our ledger resources. The very first one is transactions, and the next one is accounts. So this is just the bare minimum set of ledgers, just as a training exercise to get you familiarized with defining fields and indices and reference keys in Twisp, and then also inserting into our ledgers. So with transactions, it comes with a few properties. We have the transaction ID, which is a UUID. We have an account ID, also UUID. And then we have an int associated with an amount and a posted on timestamp. Normally, we would have a double entry ledger set up with some more sophisticated features, but for the purpose of our example, this is just a really simple ledger. We have the bare minimum set of parameters for our transaction ledger. Down here, we've set up indices. So for our first index, there's a partition on the transaction ID, so we can do an exact lookup on our transactions. And then there's also an index set up by account ID, so we can get all the transactions for a single account. Finally, this is our reference keys. And what this does is it gives us referential integrity with the account ledger. We want to make sure that we don't remove any data that our transactions relies on. And this is just a simple safety feature that we have in our ledger. Next, we have our accounts. Again, very simple, just an account ID, a customer name, and a balance. Right now, this balance is not going to change at all. It's just going to stay pretty much as zero, unless we decide to mutate or alter the account. In part 3 of Getting Started with Twisp, we'll be defining a trigger which will actually start modifying this account balance. But for now, we're just going to be creating an account, and then we're also going to be creating some transactions along with that account. And also finally, there's one special parameter here in the accounts ledger. We also have joins, and this is our join to the transaction ledger. All right, let's pop back into our console here. You should be able to log in to this after you've set up your account and installed Twisp and have been given an invite. As soon as you log in, you'll be plopped right here into the console, and we can now look at our ledgers real quick. And so here I can see the ones that I have declared in my resource from part 1. We can see the accounts. Again, there's all the parameters, there's our indices, and here's our transactions. Also, here are our indices and our schema. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an account before we create a actual transaction. We want to be able to tie our transactions to some customer. So here's our first account. We can click the copy here to just grab that mutation that we're going to plop into our GraphQL console. And then we're going to head back to Twisp, remove this comment, this welcome message, and we'll plop in our mutation. And then we'll hit run. There's also a shortcut for running, which is Control-Enter. I just click on this little play button. And here we can see we didn't get any errors. we've added our account for Giovanni Medici. And here our response corresponds to what we see in Twisp as well. So real quick, one key thing to note is that in the documents parameter, we use this UUID function to ensure that this ID key is unique within our data set. There's also another function which is just UUID.new, and that'll generate one from scratch. But this one we hard coded or just defined this key. So that way it's really easy to just follow along with the rest of the examples. But normally you would just be generating one from scratch. What this is a part of is the Common Expression Language, also known as CEL. CEL is defined in the double quotes. This can be a string, which is just wrapped in a single quote up here. But CEL is always wrapped in just double quotes. And what CEL allows us to do is that it gives us access to some really cool functions and macros. This is how we do things with timestamps, or maybe we'll have to play with arrays and do mathematics upon them. But there's lots of different functions and cool things that are available to us as we're creating data. CEL is a project that is open sourced by Google, and you can see the spec here along with some of the operators and macros that it ships with, but we've also extended it. And in our documentation, when you click on functions, you can see some of the functions that we've added, and they're all very useful for creating data. So pop it back in here. There's also another way to put data into Twisp, which is that we have access to variables. Down here you can see we can set some variables as well. I could just copy that and paste that in here. And then when I'm adding an account, I can reference that variable. So here we can see that I'm going to be using the UUID new for our insert transaction, but in our variable, what we've kept is our account ID, which is a reference back to Giovanni Medici. So I'm going to first plug in this mutation that I've copied. We can see that this is how we reference the scoped variable down here in the query variables. And we're just referencing it using context.variables account ID. And we're also ensuring that this is going to be unique. And the timestamp, we're just hard coding it. We could also use now, but just for this example, we're just going to use this hard coded one. And as soon as we hit run, we can see that we're getting back our transaction that we've created. So there's a new UUID right here. Oh no, sorry. There's a new UUID right here for our transaction. And it's still referencing Giovanni de Medici, and it's using the posted on timestamp that is down here in the variables. And we can verify that this is working out. So for the purpose of this exercise, we're also going to add two more transactions, one for 50 cents and one for 75 cents. So we go ahead and copy that, hit run. Here we can see we have a new UUID for our transaction ID. And now we'll put in the 75 cents, and again, we'll have a brand new UUID. But all the transaction posted on timestamps are the same, and they all reference Giovanni Medici's account ID. So now we have all this data in our ledger. Let's read from it real quick to make sure that we have it. So we've already done all these steps, these prerequisite steps in the insert data, and we've set up our ledger. Let's go ahead and copy our get account query. All right, here we have Giovanni Medici's account. As you can see, the balance is still 0. As I've said again, we're going to be setting it up so that way we have a trigger or a workflow as we enter in new transactions to update this balance. But we can see, though, the account does exist. Here we go. We see our response matches what we're seeing on the screen. It's important to look at this query and see that we have to use an index. You can't define a ledger without an index, and you can't define a query without an index. Now let's look at the transactions associated with that account as well. So we're going to go ahead and copy this query, paste it in here. Now we can see that we also have added transactions, their amounts, and posted ons. When we hit run, we can see the 3 transactions that we've created. And here we can see our corresponding result matches what we've done in the console. So that's it for part 2. We're just inserting some transactions. We first created an account, and now we're checking that we can see the account as well as the transactions. For part 3, we're going to be setting up the final step of the Getting Started guide, which is defining a trigger. We're going to look at the record history, which goes into showing sort of the underlying data structure of what we're capturing in Twisp's immutable ledger, which is extremely useful for doing things like reconciliation or checking where in our application and when we've been modifying data or producing data. So I hope you've enjoyed this part 2 of the Getting Started. I'll see you in part 3.